Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Joe. As always, it's a pleasure to be back in Glenties. And every time I come to Glenties, I learn something new. And what I've learned this time is that phrase, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Well, at the Glenties Summer School, there's no lunch at all. Which means that you must have extraordinary endurance to attend this summer school. And one of the things I will argue is that, in fact, one of the attributes of the European Union, and it's a very young institution in historical terms, is that it is very resilient. And I will argue it's much more resilient than many would claim. So what am I going to say? And I have 15 minutes to say it. I'm going to talk about 2 shocks, 5 reasons why the challenges facing the EU this time are different. I go back to basics with 5 principles about the EU, and I'll end up with 4 priorities. And then we'll see where we go within the 15 minutes. So firstly, the 2 shocks. The EU has undoubtedly, since 2008-9, experienced 2 extraordinary external shocks. The first was the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which triggered a deep, fundamental, great recession across the world, the most serious financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression, unprecedented. And that morphed in the eurozone into really, really serious challenges. The young currency didn't have a normal downturn in the business cycle to deal with. It had a great recession, it was ill-designed, and it has struggled to cope with it. The second was, while Europe was struggling internally in the eurozone to cope with this, Europeans were reminded that the world of power had not gone away. Mr. Putin reintroduced power politics to the European continent, and the delight of the Arab Spring at the beginning turned into the Arab winter. So Europe, this part of the world that you see on the map, faced extraordinary challenges over the last 5 to 6 years. And in my view, dealing with those challenges is particularly difficult because this time it's different. The first is that in the eurozone, the crisis affected different countries differently. Some, the strong, the creditors, were able to come through the crisis, but all those countries underneath, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Greece and Cyprus, they all had a balance of payments problems. They were in really poor condition to deal with the shock. You see in terms of their debt, look at those Greek debt levels shooting up, but not just Greece, all the other countries as well. So a crisis is easy to deal with if everyone faces the same problems. But in this Eurozone crisis, these countries faced different problems. You were either a creditor or a debtor, and it really mattered which one of those you were. So it's easy to deal with things, as I said, when it's even. But when the interests are so different and there's such deep divergence, then you are going to have a lot of contestation and a lot of conflict. Conflict about who's to blame, what sort of crisis this is, what's to be done, and the critical question of who's going to pay. All political issues that have a who's going to pay question are difficult political issues to answer. So it's not unexpected that Europe has struggled to deal with this. In fact, I would argue that given how badly prepared it was and how poor the absence of the instruments to deal with it, one could argue that they have at least taken the heat out of the acute phase of the crisis. Second, and this relates to what's happening in politics in Europe, you could argue that in any great recession, when societies are loose of their moorings and you've lots of people who are vulnerable and lots of people who are losers, then you're going to have a lot of political stress. It would be remarkable if democratic politics was not stressed under the conditions that Europe has had. So how has the stress manifested itself? It has manifested itself firstly in incumbent governments losing power. It's a tough time to be in government. If you're in government, you're taking tough decisions, and electorates have weak tolerance or, in some cases, no tolerance for the longevity of the problems that we have faced. Also, the centre is under European politics. For the last post-war period have pivoted round the centre-left, centre-right. That's been the political spectrum. But there are now challenger parties to the left. There's the rise of radical left-wing parties in many countries, particularly in the Mediterranean countries, and you have the rise of radical right parties as well. So you have the political spectrum is stretched much wider than it's ever been in the post-war period in European politics, and the centre is struggling to hold. And we see this very, very clearly in two elections in Europe in the last 6 months. On the one hand, we see Syriza, the radical left party, gaining power in a coalition in Greece, in Athens, and we see, on the other hand, the true Finns make it into government in Finland. The Finns are a radical right, and Syriza is a radical left. So the composition of governments is changing as the centre struggles to hold. And I can guarantee you that before the end of the year, Spain's well-established two-party system since the collapse of Franco will not be a two-party system after the next Spanish elections. How does it manifest itself in Ireland? It manifests itself in Ireland in two ways: the rise of Sinn Féin on the one hand, and this extraordinary vote for anyone else that goes, i.e. the independents. I mean, 33% in the latest polls. So there's a lot of volatility and uncertainty in politics in Europe today. And that again means that government formation, party competition, is all much, much tougher. The end of the taboos. I think we should be really worried in European history when the one thing the EU did for Europe was that it introduced a level of civility to political debate. There were taboos in the political system and in the political process, and taboos are not an unhealthy thing. But for a Greek newspaper to show a German chancellor decked out in a Nazi uniform is a breach of a taboo. Equally, in Das Bild, the German populist party or populist newspaper, the depiction of Greeks, again, leaves a lot to answer for. So what we have in Europe today is the introduction of a coarseness in politics and a weakening of civility. And I think I see it and observe it in Dáil Éireann as well. And it's a very dangerous thing for politics. The one thing democratic politics must be about is respect for the other view, regardless of how profoundly you disagree with it. Profoundly disagree with it, but there must be respect within the political realm and political discourse. The next change we face, and we've already discussed it, disintegration. This system is facing two very significant disintegrative challenges. One, the prospect of Brexit that we already discussed this morning, and secondly, the prospect of Grexit. At the European Council, that long all-night European Council last week, 9 of 19 governments would have been prepared to let Greece go. That's how serious Grexit, that's how close it came. And in my view, as I will say later, it remains very fragile. Greek membership of the EU remains, in my view, very fragile. And then the world has not gone away. Mr. Putin thinks that this part of the world is decadent, soft, unwilling to fight, with no red lines. And he's challenging it. He's overflying Finland non-stop, he's overflying Norway, he's pushing at the 3 small Baltic countries. He is funding radical right elements throughout Europe. He's funding any dissonant political groups in Europe that he thinks will long-term suit him. Now, if the future of Europe is Putin's future, I don't want to be part of that Europe. I don't want to live in that Europe. This is a Europe that is not worth arguing for, not alone fighting for. But we also look to the south. Look what the collapse of Iraq and the arrival of ISIS has done. And when you read about ISIS, it's seen in terms of there's this return to medieval barbarity. This is a truly modern 21st century phenomenon. They use internet, they use all of the tricks of the trade. And, of course, there's a link between the ins and outs, because we now have young Europeans who will go, young women and young men, to fight for that. People who were born in Europe, educated in Europe, and will now go and be part of this. And that world hasn't gone away. And I could also talk about the economy, but in my view, the economy is almost less important. But Europe does need to face up to the fact that it now lives in a world of very major growing economies, the BRICS, and that's not going to change. We should celebrate the fact that China has become, that China has taken so many people out of poverty. Yes, it threatens our economic well-being in that we've got to watch our competitiveness, but it is, in human terms, a very good thing. So Europe now finds itself, instead of surrounded by a circle of friends, it's surrounded by a circle of threats and risks. And that will require a response. So to borrow from Lenin, what's to be done? Well, in my view, the last thing the EU now needs is major, major transformation and reform. And why do I say that? If you try to re-engineer the constitution of this system or its institutions today, it would be like taking a patient who has been moved from the intensive care unit to the recovery unit and then telling them within 10 months you've got to run a marathon. Trust is low in the system, there's a lot of fatigue in the system, and it now actually needs to just go into coping mode for long enough. I'm not saying there's no need for reform. What I'm saying is let's not be too ambitious at this stage. Keep, in other words, watch the bases here. So then back to first principles. We heard a lot today about the EU. And there is a lot that one can say about it, and there's a lot that one can criticise about this half-formed, unusual political system. But the first thing I would say is values and law. In human history, there is only one example of independent countries agreeing voluntarily, with no army and no compunction, to create a system based on shared values and the rule of law. It is and does not exist anywhere else in the world. Given the shadow of our history, we should not take that achievement for granted, nor should we be complacent about it, but it is one of the core principles of the system. Secondly, membership. What is it to be an EU member state? What is it to be a member state? Well, if the 19th and 20th century sovereignty was about creating borders and closure, the 21st century requires sharing and collaboration. And it means that you work hard if you're a member state of the EU, you do your homework, you broadly abide by the rules and the law, not always, as we know, because human life and human nature is imperfect, our institutions are imperfect. But also there's a danger in thinking you become an EU member state and somehow or other the world takes care of you then. It doesn't. Being a member state of the EU requires more of your politicians, more of your institutions, and more of the national societies. It is not a ticket to prosperity. It is an opportunity that you either use or don't use. And learning to be a member state of the EU and cope with internationalisation is harder for some countries than others. Third, solidarity. We've heard a lot over the last 6 months, and particularly over the last month, about a failure of European solidarity. I think the EU has been more open from the beginning to the membership of poor states, including this state, than any other single organisation I can think of that is not involved in broadly North-South, i.e. The Global South. From the time Ireland joined, most of the new member states have been poorer than the rich. Most of them. Not all, but most of them. Do we seriously think that after the collapse of communism in 1989, that the countries of East Central Europe could have made the transition to market economies and democracies easily, in prosperity and without war, without the EU, and the tough conditions the EU insisted on in letting them in the first place. So there is solidarity in the EU. We benefited from it, our roads, etc., but that solidarity is contingent on it's a solidarity to catch up. What the EU hasn't agreed to be, and I suspect I'll wait, is that it's a big transfer union. It's not going to redistribute extraordinary amounts of money from one country to the other because taxpayers in one country simply won't agree. But there will be more solidarity, but not that much. Complexity. We think of the EU as this extraordinary complex levels, layers, ministers this, ministers that, civil servants this, civil servants that, all meeting like a working beehive in Brussels day in, day out, except for August. And people say, oh, the complexity. But if you think about what it requires to reach agreement, high levels of agreement among 28 countries, why are we surprised that this is a complex system? And so, yes, some processes could be simplified, and certainly regulation could be simplified, but you will not take complexity out of this system. Duality and multiplicity. If nationalism in the 19th and 20th century was making me feel Irish and exclusively Irish and the other were the English, the world we live in today is a world in which I can be Irish. Well, firstly, I'm a Kerry woman. Then I'm Irish. And then I can be European. It's a world of multiplicity. And how our societies deal with multiplicity, deal with the way in which difference is combined, will have a major, major impact on the world that our children live in. And then finally, from multi-level governance, we've a lot of it, to multi-level politics. We're for the first time seeing serious political contagion in the EU. There was a time when national politics was contained. Ministers went to Brussels, they came back with their decisions, but they didn't. What happened in Brussels was really not going to make a big difference to the next election. We now know that events in Greece can impact on politics in Spain, on politics in Ireland, on politics in all sorts of other countries. So, in my view, we have to cope with the multiplicity, the complexity, and we have to cope with the fact that we now live in that no politician in Europe today can insulate themselves from the politics of anywhere else. It's all mixed up. So then to the priorities. What should now be done? Or what are the priorities? Clearly the euro. The experience of Greece has been bruising for the Greek system, bruising for Greek society, and bruising for the Greek government. But they really, really mishandled. The Syriza government really mishandled its engagement with the EU. There were enough of them that wanted Greece out, but they knew the people didn't agree, so they deliberately engaged in the system in the way they did, and there were certain members of the Syriza government in that camp. There were others who were simply naive and misunderstood the forces available. Basically, they were in the most vulnerable position, and they also thought that they could have an anti-German coalition. They couldn't, and they didn't. But the majority of Greek people still want to stay in the euro. Whether their economy can actually cope, I'm not sure. But if they do, Greece has no choice but to finally use the opportunities of EU membership. Greece became an EU state in 1981. I would say it is the singular example of a country that failed to really use the opportunities. It's a tragedy for Greece, to use the pun, but I think Greece has no choice but to a lot of internal reform. And if you think that the current agreement, one of the main stipulations in the current agreement is that Greece establishes an independent revenue collecting system. Now, the EU should not have to tell the Greek state that that's what it needs to do. The Greek state should have done that 30 years ago, and it certainly should have done it in 2009 when it was in such a weak and vulnerable position. Greece is going to need debt relief. How that happens remains to be seen, but there will have to be, and it's going to have to need investment. And no one will invest, no private sector will invest in Greece at the moment, so it's going to have to come from public funds. So Greece really needs an opportunity. Whether it can take it or not, in my view, there won't be a fourth bailout. This is the last chance saloon for Greece. And I think it's important for us as Irish people to actually think through and understand our experience of the last 5 years. Our two governments were much more cautious, much more careful, much more compliant. As the siren singers said to them, you better do this and you better do that. I rest the case that the Irish state elite made a much better job at getting Ireland out of where we were. And we shouldn't be complacent because we shouldn't have been there in the first place. But at least when we were down that black hole, there was an understanding that we were there. Migration. Africa is not experiencing any demographic downturn because it's still too poor a continent. You got a demographic downturn in Asia, in Latin America with economic growth. It's not happening in Africa. The migratory pressures from Africa are going to continue to be really strong over the next 10 to 15 years, 20 years. And Europe has got to have a policy. Those who say open the borders or those who say close the borders, neither of those are policies. You need a policy of managed migration and you do need to get after the traffickers in the Mediterranean because those migratory pressures, and I see it daily in Italy. If you're a mayor of Florence, you can get a call every night of the week to say you've got to find accommodation for another 500 people. It's putting Italy under extraordinary strain. So, migration. I won't say anything about voice and exit. We heard a lot about Britain, other than to say that I think a UK withdrawal from the EU would be, for the EU, would be an enormous loss. And then the world out there. The world out there isn't going to go away. I think that Europe will have to, with the United States, but if necessary on its own, it's going to have to pay more attention to defence and security over the next period. And it's going to have to, it may mean at some stage that dealing with ISIS means someone's troops are going to have to hit the ground, that it can't be left to the Kurdish Peshmerga to carry that and the other tribal forces out there. So Europe faces, these are priorities, they are important, and Europe isn't going to easily or lightly tackle them. And finally, I'm going to say something about grabbing the narrative. We heard this morning, I think there was a phrase, hopeless Europe or hopeless EU. The EU is shambles, the EU this, the EU that. And there is a strong argument to be made for all of those. But I think it's about time that those who think that by and large, with all of its warts and all of its problems and all of its challenges, that the EU has been broadly a source of good rather than ill, a platform for countries, be they small and poor or large and not know that they're small yet, that it has been, if we feel that it has broadly been that, then I think it's important. What you tend to get among pro-Europeans is there's always something more to be done. There's always another frontier. The present is never okay. Well, I think it's about time that those who think that the EU broadly, and I say broadly, I say it guardedly, is something that has added to the world in which we live in rather than detracted, then I think it's about time to grab that narrative back from both those on the radical left and the radical right. When I hear Marine Le Pen, she equates the EU with the Soviet Union. That's her image of the EU. That is profoundly historically ignorant. And it does no justice to all those millions of people that were killed in that part of the world, in that political system. And I want to go back. I went to Robert Schumann's house this year. I thought that as the director of the Robert Schuman Centre, it behoved me to to visit his house. And I saw on his desk, the desk he sat at, I saw the notes that he had written to himself on the speech, the Schuman Declaration. And I thought, here was someone who was there in Alsace-Lorraine, caught between borders, deeply enculturated into that Franco-German history and problems, that riddle of the Rhine. And I'm not going to quote for you what he said in the Schuman Declaration. Rather, before he died in 1963, Schuman said, "The hard lessons of history have taught me not to trust hurried improvisations or overly ambitious projects." The EU is going to have to be something between a hurried improvisation and it can't be too ambitious, because in the end it can only be achieved by the consent and consensus of Europe's peoples. And I think also it's important, regardless of the EU, that we in Europe feel both the confidence in our institutions, in our democracies, in the long centuries that it took to bring arbitrary power under control in this part of the world. And we should trust our creativity and our future. We're still if you look across European cities and you ask me where would I like to live, any European city would be high on my list. So the achievements are there. Of course, there's always dangers of complacency. There should never be any smugness about the achievements, because history teaches us that there are switching times. Max Weber said there are switching times in history, and at those times, knowingly or unknowingly, people can sleepwalk into all sorts of different things. So I would say we need to guard against the sleepwalking, and one of the things we should guard against is to make sure at least that when we discuss the EU, not that it should be a discussion based on this is nirvana. Nirvana is, in any political system, I've never seen it, I doubt I ever will, but this is something that has been created by institutions, by men and women, and is something, in my view, that we need to at least understand. Thank you.